I'm now going to hand over the program to Debbie Anderson, who will help us open up tonight's program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debbie Anderson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education and Engagement. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second Heart in Hand virtual book talk. The Heart in Hand virtual book talk was developed as part of our library's equity initiative. These talks feature engaging conversations with authors and other leaders about issues concerning equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's our hope that this series can inspire people to open their hearts and minds to learning about diverse experiences, structural racism, and injustices against people of color. And tonight, we're featuring a conversation about one of humanity's great unifiers, and that is food. But more specifically, how food can help open our minds and hearts to different cultures and life experiences. And so now I'd like to hand it over to one of our librarians who has prepared introductions to tonight's featured speakers, Mrs. Annie Shin of Clifton M. Brackenseek Library.
Hi everyone, my name is Annie Shin and I'm a librarian with Clifton M. Brackenseek Library in Belfast. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to introduce you to tonight's speakers. Leading tonight's conversation is our very own library director, Skye Patrick. Skye Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016. In her role, she's responsible for the library's 86 libraries, 18 vehicle mobile fleet, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. Patrick is committed to breaking down barriers and increasing access for all. In addition to helping LA County Library go fine-free and initiating several other services to help provide more access and opportunity for customers, Patrick launched the library's iCount Equity Initiative, which I'm part of this year. Woohoo! The library's iCount Equity Initiative ensures that library services and programs address the needs of the diverse communities across LA County. Patrick continues to reinforce the library's role in the community as a civic and cultural center, a hub for public information, services, and discourse, and an institution of literacy, innovation, and lifelong learning. Tonight, Skye will be interviewing author and food ethnographer Junjo Lee. Hi, June! Lee is a resident food ethnographer for Google's Global Food Program and is an author of children's books focused on stories about diverse food cultures. She's the co-author of Sandor Katz and the Tiny Wild, which will be published later this month, and Chef Roy Choi and the Street Food Remix, which received the Sibert Award honor for Most Distinguished Informational Book for Children in 2018. Chef Roy Choi and the Street Food Remix and other resources that reflect diverse food culture through books, documentaries, films, and cookbooks can be found by our digital library at www.lacountylibrary.org. Thank you, Skye and June, for being with us tonight. Skye, we'll hand the program over to you.
And I just want to say thank you to Annie Shin. That's really a great acknowledgement. We do a lot of work around culture, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it doesn't happen without the staff's dedication to the ICON initiative. So thanks, Annie, wherever you went. Let's get into this book talk. I have so many questions for you. I want to start with I think the most simplest question that I can come up with for our audience, which is this one. What is a food ethnographer?
I know everybody asks me that because I kind of made up the term. And in fact, I own the URL foodethnographer.com. I studied cultural anthropology. And so I am able to apply anthropological theories on culture and ethnographic methodology. So I believe, how shall I explain it? So I look at culture. Culture is everything that we share in common and that we all know. So everybody knows when they see fire sticks on cake that it's a birthday. Everybody sort of knows what you eat at a baseball game versus what you would eat maybe on Thanksgiving Day. So those sorts of things are what cultural anthropologists study. And ethnography is a method for exploring living cultures. So really using stories from people and observations of people in the context of their everyday lives and making sense of all of that.
Thank you. I love that. So basically, if I heard you correctly, it's like both the universality of culture and the specificity of culture that really makes an ethnographer generally, and then a food ethnographer is, of course, focusing in on the food. I love that. I'm going to have to look into that one. When I saw that, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and thank you for saying cultures. Very much.
Yeah.
It's all about cultures and the
Yes,
diversity of cultures.
that's right. I think you and I are in agreement on that. You know, you did talk a little bit about your background, your educational or maybe professional academic background, but if you could talk a little bit more about what's influenced your journey to become, like, how did you get here? Studying ethnography, like what made you venture into food, I wonder?
Yeah, that's such a big question, Skye. Uh, I I I was born in Korea, South Korea, and then came to the States when my parents came over as graduate students. And I started kindergarten in Palo Alto, California, and that's when the lights went on, and that's when I started seeing the world beyond myself. And I remember being teased a lot in Palo Alto, teased because name calls because of the way I looked, but also because of my food. Kids would make fun of seaweed snacks that I would bring and say, gross, you're eating black paper, or when they would come over to my house, they would say my house smelled stinky because of the kimchi. And so kimchi became a tricky food for me. It was both a source of great comfort and safety because it was the food that my mother made at home. And it was also a food of shame because it marked me as different, as not belonging, as alien as my green card stated I was. And so I wanted to explore a lot of that, this identity crisis I had. And rather than studying psychology, I studied cultural anthropology because a lot of, I think, my identity crisis came through culture. And I love culture, but culture also can hold some bad habits that get passed down generation through generation, as well as, delicious foods that get passed down. So I wanted to truly understand who I was.
Yeah, that's a really great way of saying that. And the first thing I thought of when you said that the kids would make fun of you because of kimchi and seaweed. How many times do you walk into Whole Foods and see like a plethora of different seaweed? I personally buy it for my daughter, and it's like a point of a point of contention, a personal contention as a young person, and how things ultimately, with any luck, evolve and become part of our sort of universal vernacular, like seaweed as an example.
Mhm.
So interesting that you would bring that up. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about this book that I'm sorry, two books here. So the common theme that we're seeing in your books, including Chef Roy Choi and the Street Food Remix, I love that title, by the way, and Sandor Katz, the Tiny Wild. How is food, I'm sorry, is food the way to bridge cultures and people? I think I know the answer, but if you could kind of talk about that a little bit, and if you can share your inspiration behind this and how food can expand our youth's understanding of other cultures. One of the big things we try to focus on as a public library is figuring out how to open the minds of young people specifically, but people in general. So can you speak on those two things?
Yeah, I would love to. So, Chef Roy Choi and the Street Food Remix is the first book that I co-authored with my co-author Jacqueline Briggs Martin. And she invited me to write that book because she said, June, I grew up in Maine and I live in Iowa. And I love Chef Roy Choi, but I'm not Korean. I don't share those experiences. And so she invited me to co-author that. And then we had such a great time collaborating and writing the book that we wanted to write another book together. And so that's how we came to think about Sandor Katz. And I think food is a theme throughout both those books, but more specifically, kimchi. So going back to that initial as a child, that confusion about who I was because of what I ate, and what I ate didn't quite fit in, just like I didn't fit in. And I wanted to explore all that. And so I think, Skye, every book I will write will have kimchi in it in some way, because that is one of the big topics that I am exploring, which is fermenting who we are, in a way, fermenting all our hot messes together to try to make something more delicious. And food is a magical bridge that connects all of us. In fact, when I talk about Chef Roy Choi, I tell kids, you could say, you could refuse to try your friend's foods and just say, yuck, I don't want to try that. But that's actually putting up a wall. But if you try it, you can try it. You don't have to like it, but you can try it. And just by trying someone's food, it becomes a bridge, and it opens up your world and makes your world larger. And I think that is a theme that runs throughout both stories.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a French guy who Brilliant Savran, Jean Brilliant Savran, who talked about, tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are. And I think that is so relevant. The fact that you can find all kinds of foods at a grocery store today tells us, I think we're moving in the right direction. It means that we eat all cultures, and so in a way, we have such a more delicious, nourishing world because of that.
yeah, you left me with two great ideas to the point I had to write it down, but this is, I think, really critical. Without trying, that puts up walls, and food is to build bridges. June, I'm going to take that one. I'm going to take that one. I think another really critical thing you said here is fermenting who we are. We're all hot messes.
There's a lot of hot messes, right? I mean,
that's right.
A lot, right?
I will attest to being a hot mess on occasion, but putting them together creates something delicious. I love that. I love that idea. So yeah, I'm taking both of those with me tonight. I have a couple more questions here for you. So in Chef Bok Choy and the Street Food Remix, readers learn how Chef Choi breaks barriers by forging new types of cuisine, by essentially remixing two different kinds of delicious cuisine, specifically Korean and Mexican cuisine. Can you share with us some of your thoughts on how Roy Choi's culinary ventures represent today's America? You spoke on this, but I think this deserves an additional spotlight, if you could just expound on that.
Of course, and especially for LA, because Kogi barbecues, I think the late Jonathan Gold, the food writer, called it LA on a plate. But China, Koreatown was right next to all all the taco trucks and oftentimes in a kitchen, all cultures are sort of mixing in the back of the house. And so when you think about a universally loved food format, the taco, the handheld, and then you put some Korean spicing on it, which we don't use cumin, and it's a little bit sweeter, tangier maybe, and just as spicy as Mexican food can be. You have this amazing remixed combination. And I think that is the beauty of LA. It's the beauty of California, America, and more increasingly the world. I heard that in Sweden, they have Taco Fridays, and in Sweden, they all eat tacos. And so I'm really curious what Swedish tacos look like. But I think the more that we eat each other's foods and remix it, and kids today are themselves third culture. We're all in some ways remixes. I think it just makes things more fun and new and exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I was recently in Norway, and the Norwegians shared with me their national food is tacos.
Oh, is that
I
right?
actually, yes, I actually did have a Norwegian taco, and it wasn't significantly different than what I'm accustomed to here in Los Angeles. But I am of the belief that everything is better in a taco. So anything tacoed works well for me and my taste buds.
Yeah. And one thing that Chef Roy
Yeah.
Choi did was he was the first business on Twitter. And so that made the difference between just a
Oh.
lunch truck and a food truck was that now, people could find him on Twitter. They could find that Kogi truck. And wherever they would start roaming, they would create street culture right there where there wasn't people. Food tends to be a magnet and brings people out. And so he was able to create neighborhoods and street culture where it was just cars.
I actually didn't know that he was the first business on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so not only are you a food ethnographer, but you are a low-key librarian as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a pretty extensive question. Bear with me as I read it here. In Sandor Katz and the Tiny Wild, young readers learn about food writers and AIDS survivor Sandor Katz and how he experimented with a variety of no-heat cooking methods using microbes. This is right up my alley. The book exposes us to fermentation, food preparation across different cultures, from German sauerkraut to obviously Korean kimchi, Ethiopian injera. I want to make sure I got that right. The flatbread, which I love. Indian dosas. Can you talk and share with us a little bit about what this book means when it says fermentation is a magical bridge that concerns all, and all people, plants, and the tiny wild? Again, you kind of spoke on it, but I think this really centers the work here.
Yeah, if growing up, I was born in 1970 and in Korea, lived in Houston, Texas, then moved to Palo Alto where I started kindergarten. And, in the 70s, the way I saw the world, we were all very different. And oftentimes we didn't mix together. I would hear stories from my parents' friends who lived in Germany, where in Germany, they also the Korean friends would go to Germany and they would be told, "Oh, you cannot, keep kimchi in the refrigerator. It smells, it stinks too much." And so, I was just sort of tracking all these differences because of the way food smells and our food preferences. And then I picked up a book by Sandor Katz called Wild Fermentation. And suddenly the light bulb went off. Like I mentioned, sauerkraut is Korean kimchi. German sauerkraut is Korean kimchi. It's just that we add a few more spicing to ours. And that was like a light bulb moment when I realized we're people. We're all, human beings, and we like delicious foods, especially fermented foods. And when you think about the most common fermented foods, they're a collaboration between human beings, plants, and the tiny wild microbes. So bacteria, yeast, mold, fungi that eat the sugars in the plants, and the human beings create the right conditions so that the right tiny wild, it's a food safety strategy so that the tiny wild will transform the food without heat into deep, deep, oftentimes umami, delicious, crunchy flavors that we love so much, like cheese. Yeah, cheese is fermented, sourdough bread, sauerkraut, kimchi, chocolate, coffee. Vinegar, so many of the foods that we love, kombucha, are fermented, yogurt, kefir. I could go on.
Yeah, you need to maybe go back a little bit and talk about my chocolate is fermented. I don't know that I knew that.
Yeah, I believe the cacao fruit ferments, and then you take out the chocolate pods and roast them.
Oh,
And
that's great.
same with the coffee fruit, the coffee berries. Yeah, so they're often fermented with the fruit, and then they take out the seeds or the pods and start roasting them, and it just creates so many complex flavors that our bodies crave. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. Just from personal experience, when I was younger, I kind of played around with, dabbed into raw foodism,
Yeah.
and I
Didn't we
recall,
all?
well,
For
we are in
a minute.
California.
Yeah.
It was incredibly, it was an auspicious diet. It was very hard to maintain, for me anyway, it was. Um, but I do remember a lot of language and a lot of reading around this idea of fermenting one's food and really the benefits of or maybe those are the microbes that you're speaking of, but the flora in one's gut, and having fermented food really work well, I guess, for the gut flora. Does that sound
Yeah.
close? Okay. Yeah, but interesting. I hadn't actually thought of coffee and chocolate, of all things, being fermented. So thank you for that. And I love this idea that food is a collaboration of humans, plants, and microbes. That's such a beautiful way to look at it. You're also, I guess, low-key poet as well here.
Mhm.
I'm finding out a lot about you.
Mm.
How do you think parents and caregivers and educators using food literacy as a method for helping children and youth expand their understanding of different people, cultures, life experience, and even sciences? And this makes me think of, like, what can we do as parents? I'm a parent to a young child, and I would hope that she would never say something as awful as your food stinks to another child. But I don't know that for sure. So, like, what do you think? Like, where can we begin educating our young people to these different cultures and being respectful of one's food or someone else's food from another culture?
Yeah, I think food is the first lesson that we teach our babies, right? Starting with mother's milk, and as a parent, teach your baby child what's good to eat. And what's good to eat is often determined by culture. It's determined by your ancestors who uh, developed a way of eating that worked in the local place that they were in. And yeah, they made delicious food, all 4 seasons. If you come from a place with seasonality, like Korea, which has 4 very distinct seasons and very cold. And so fermentation kimchi was a way of preserving vegetables for those hard winter months when there wasn't much growing because everything was iced over. And so I grew up in Korea, biculturally in Korea as well as here in the United States. And in my Korean culture, food is really a huge lesson. Like parents will not accept yuck. Parents will just continue to introduce foods that they're eating from their table to kids and just make it make it important. Like it's a really, really important ancestral practice to pass along foods of your family. And so they put great effort into that. And I think as a food ethnographer, and I've done a lot of research, consumer research for food companies. I think what I've learned from my professional research is that we have, as consumers, outsourced much of our food to the food industry. From packaged foods to grocery stores that sell packaged foods and their own fresh prepared foods to restaurants. We've outsourced so much of our food. And so I think we have to take that back. That connection to our food, where our food comes from, flavors, and you know, the palate could be thought about as a muscle, and we need to exercise our palate to be able to accept a diversity of complex and simple flavors in different combinations and pairings. And so I think food is a great place to start in, and I think we have to take that back, and we can also create delicious flavors, complex flavors, and that's what Sandor Katz shows us through fermentation. He's really known as a DIY guy, and wants us to, you know, take back the power of making food, creating food, growing food, cooking food, creating new delicious flavors, experimenting, take all of that back into our homes. So
Yeah, you remind me of a couple of things, June, a couple of thoughts that I'll maybe add to this conversation. You know, there's been this whole idea, probably in the last decade, of sort of a remigration back to the South. And when I mean South, I really mean places where it's not as industrialized, and it's not as compact as city life. And this idea that younger people in the younger generation is really refocusing on growing their own food, learning how to grow food. Or even if you're in the city, for instance, we have like a little, you know, a little garden we're working on. But the dedication of learning how to grow one's own food, and even in fermenting by extension, because I think a lot of us, because of our schedules, we, as you said, we've been co-opted and outsourced our whole food intake, and there are cumulative issues. We won't talk about the health issues about all of that, but I do think that there is this now examining of what is food, and what is it to grow one's own food, or even have authentic whole foods. So I think you're touching on something pretty significant, and thank you for calling that out in this conversation.
well, you know, it reconnects us to where we come from, and it reconnects us to our community, people all around us, but it also reconnects us back to the land, to landscapes and to plants. And I think it's a much more delicious and nourishing way to approach all the changes in climate and you know, inequity all those hot messes. So that's what I'm calling hot messes, like
That's right. Yes,
systemic
absolutely.
catastrophe and equity issues and just injustice and old stories that are continuing this idea, this myth of separation, keeping us apart, keeping us out of our power. And I think food is just such a good way to start that, weaving the fact that we're all interconnected with, not with each other, with other humans, but also with beyond the humans kingdoms, animals, the plant kingdom, mushrooms,
Mushrooms. That's a whole other book talk I think we should do in a year.
Yeah, could be maybe our next one. I don't know.
Yes,
I'm
indeed.
in love with mushrooms.
It's interesting that you bring up this idea as we talk about, weaving cultures and respecting the differences, but acknowledging the similarities. Um, this idea of us really taking sort of another approach to land, not only just growing our food, but recognizing that we share land with other beings, animals, microbes, plants, and really taking sort of a indigenous approach to land. Generally when we start these programs, we do a land acknowledgement, and we got a little mixed up because we couldn't get the technology to run. But I think really what we're trying to do is, one, acknowledge where this land has come from, but also try to reforge a connection to the land. And that includes growing one's own food and being just more conscious of all the hot messes, as you say, and hopefully having an opportunity to move forward in another way. Excuse me.
Falling in love with our places, with our landscape, where we are. Like, could we all fall in love with each other and different, delicious vegetables and, the honeys made by the bees? And could we fall in love with Earth? Could we fall in love with Earth, And food is just such an it's such an early way. It's accessible for all ages and all people, because we all eat. Everyone eats and everyone poops. That's true. Yeah, it's just a way to fall
You've
in
read
love.
that book, I assume. Do you
Yeah,
have a young person in your life? Okay.
love that
Yeah,
book.
I think this beautifully expressed, falling in love with the earth and falling in love with each other through our foods and our cultures. I have a couple of other questions here for you. How can food be used as a tool to identify common ground? Understanding that today, all the hot messes, all the polarization, again, you did talk about this, but I think there's more to tease out here. We need to find the common ground. We are so far removed from each other. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess this Sandor book, Sandor Katz and the Tiny Wild, really is about finding that common connection, between sauerkraut and kimchi. My best friend is German. She's from Hamburg. And Sandor saw this connection between sauerkraut and kimchi. And actually, in the English language, we don't have a specific word for vegetable fermentation. But he discovered the word sauerkraut, which means sour, and then kraut means herbs, vegetables growing above land. So that was a very specific German word for vegetable fermentation. And kimchi. Kim means immersed in ocean water, so immersed in brine. And che is vegetable. So Koreans also had a very specific word for vegetable fermentation. And so what he did was he combined it. He came up with the term crouchy, and we have a recipe in the back of the book for crouchy. And in fact, I was at a school here in New York, and students made Crouchy. We made these two versions of Crouchy together. This one just has a little bit more purple cabbage, but really the same basic ingredients. And so I think finding those common ground through the foods, and especially through fermentation. Sandor always tells this story, you know, sourdough. So everybody's sourdough starter. I don't know if you started making more sourdough bread during the pandemic, but people all over, because he's, you know, the most famous fermenter in the world, well, in my world, people gave him all these special, you know, sourdough starts that that they would, you know, from their tradition. And do you know what he did with all these different starters? He just put it all together. He just combined all these, you know, sourdough starters together in a jar, because he said, you know what, they're all gonna just acclimate to the microbes here on you know, where he lives in Middle Tennessee. And he lives in Middle Tennessee. And so I think that's just such a great analogy. There's no cultural purity in a way. You know, there's delicious flavors and traditions that we've all developed because, you know, from our ancestors and because of the landscapes in which we live and the climates in which we live. But in some ways, this concept of purity doesn't exist. Yeah. And so I love what he does with his sourdough starter.
Yeah, that is that's pretty incredible. There's no cultural purity. Of course, there's cultural identity, and I think we're all in agreement there, but no purity. Interestingly enough, for this moment in time, that's nice to just kind of, we'll put a pin in that one and maybe come back. Can we talk a little bit about how food gives us a glimpse into the inequities that exist in society? I know you talked a little bit about how, you know, this idea of belonging, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, actually it's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And you talked a little bit about not belonging or not feeling as if you belong as a young person, but how do you think food kind of gives that glimpse of inequity? And maybe what we can do to start, again, begin bridging those gaps?
Well, how deep do you want me to go? Because it's, you know, it's.
How about you start and then we can kind of, we can banter.
Yeah, well, I mean, food access is a good marker of literacy access. So places where there are no easy places to buy food at a good value are also the same neighborhoods that do not have a lot of children's books. So households without children's books are those same households that live where, yeah, food is not easy to access, and the foods that you access are inexpensive and highly processed. And the reason why they're highly processed is because they don't go bad. You can't afford to lose money. You know, you can't afford to let your foods go bad, because that has to last you. You know, these are the neighborhoods without safety nets. And so they're so, food and literacy, you know, all literacy are so tightly intertwined. One of the reasons why we wrote this story about Chef Choi and the street food remix is because he started a chain of restaurants called Local, and his very first Local was in Watts in LA. And then he had another one in Oakland, and you know, he wanted to create these restaurants that cooked food that people liked, made by hand, made with love, good ingredients, and no soda pours. You know, most fast food makes their money off of soda, and so no soda pours. And we thought that was just such an amazing bridge and offering and sharing, you know, to do that. And Sandor is in some ways the same way. He's very practical. The reason why he started fermenting was to preserve food. And fermenting is a strategy for making food last long because you can keep it for a long time. It's a way of food safety and preservation, and it's easily accessible. I mean, cabbage, you can ferment cabbage to make kimchi and kraut and other kinds of delicious ferments. And so I think food access and inequity is always sort of entangled in the stories that that Jackie and I have been writing about. I don't know
Yeah,
how
that's a lot to unpack. So I'll save you from the question, but you've touched on some really important issues here about food inequity and food deserts and literacy deserts, and just like this idea of a social safety net. This department, this library really centers ourselves as participating in that safety net in ways that we can. One of the things that we do that we're preparing for right now is gearing up our lunch at the library program that starts on Monday, I believe. Monday. And really just trying to be that, again, that bridge, as you speak of, for some of these kids, specifically kids, but families in general, who just need a little bit of help to kind of get through the summer. School's out for most of the kids, or it's about to be out, and they're missing that really critical meal that they get in the middle of the day, and in some cases breakfast. And so the library positions itself, or at least we try to position ourselves, as to bridge that gap. So yeah, there's a lot there. Again, when we bring you back, excuse me.
Yeah, and some libraries have their own community gardens, and they're growing food, and they have seed catalogs, so distributing seeds so that patrons can grow their own food. And then, of course, all the stories, the how-tos. So the recipe books, the cookbooks, the growing books. I think, libraries are a great source of creating that safety net. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a frog in my throat. I apologize.
It's okay.
We actually have both of those programs. We have a garden at one, and then a seed garden at another.
Yeah. Amazing. And, something that I hope to see more is food trees. So perennials that might be planted where people can, harvest. Like, I picture kids and families like just grabbing apples or oranges or, nuts, and just being able to eat off the fat of the land in some ways. I mean, yeah.
You mentioned you were in New York, but I think that happens here in California.
Mm-hmm.
You can walk down the street and get all these different kinds of fruit just from people's yards. So it does happen a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to another question. So your career as a food ethnographer, can you identify your top 2 or 3 most fascinating cultural food practices or customs that you've encountered in your research?
Wow, that's a big question. Yes. So this is about 14 years ago or so. I was doing a project for Kraft Foods, and Kraft, the food company now called Mondelez, and maybe something else now, I don't know. They identified a cluster of consumers who weren't buying the cash cow brands like Jello or Velveeta, or these like brands that had been the backbone of Kraft. and they wanted help identifying who these consumers were. And so I did 60 ethnographies in 5 different cities, and also ran some focus groups, and we identified them as, we were calling them, code name New Age Consumer, and they turned out to be the millennials. And so, the millennials, the children of baby boomers who started artisan food practices, craft food practices, DENY, a lot of them influenced by Sandor Katz and others, Farmer Will Allen and other food heroes, who wanted to take back, flavor and cooking and growing food. And so they were the millennials as well as the young Gen Xers. And I started interviewing young Gen Xers who had children and ran focus groups. And this strange practice was occurring. And we did these in Middle America, Chicago, and, cities like that, Middle America. And parents would say, I don't want my kids to have my food habits. I want them to not be picky. I want them to be adventuresome and try all different kinds of foods, because opportunities are everywhere. And I want them to be able to be open to those opportunities. And so there were some parents who said, I'm a picky eater. Like, I don't like eating lots of different foods, but I'll pretend to eat different foods in front of my kids so that I can pass on different habits. And I think if food is if what we eat is who we are, then I think it's telling us the cultural change that we as Americans are undergoing, that we are open. So back to that theme of, teaching kids to like and try and experience, and to develop their palate, their muscle palate, to be able to try a lot of different foods. And, in some ways, I think it's a very delicious, nourishing way to be a social justice advocate through food. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to put that. And I am one of those parents that really strive not to have my daughter be as picky as me, but try different kinds of food from different cultures. Fortunately, she eats nearly everything, so that's helpful. But what 7-year-old doesn't usually? I have another question here for you. Can you talk a little bit about some of the top trends that you're noticing in the food industry and how you see these trends impacting the way consumers eat and live? And you talked a bit about this again. You're so good. You're already answering all of our questions, but if you can just expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic did something a little, it put a twist in our shared food culture a little bit. We stayed home and people started fermenting and making sourdough bread and cooking more. And then we kind of, as soon as the world opened up and restaurants opened up again, we sort of, fell out of that practice. And so I am seeing a lot more food information being served through channels like food apps and food delivery apps and TikTok. And, there's just all these different ways that people learn and experience food. And so digital food, I would say, is a huge trend, yeah, but digital, it connects us to instant food, like delivery, as well as instant digital nourishment by looking at other people eating food or listening to other people eating food, or being able to, see how others people eat food and imagining that, creating new cravings. So I think digital food has been an ongoing trend. And fermentation, I have to say, fermentation is a huge new trend. And it's not just people fermenting in their own homes. fermentation is one of the top investments in food technology right now. So investors, startups, they're interested in fermentation as a way to create more umami through plants. I think there's a lot of people interested in eating less red meat, less carbon, water intensive foods. And so there's a lot of experimentation happening with fermented foods at a industrial level to create those complex flavors, and especially umami that we crave, that come from typically, you know, the easiest way to get it is from meat. And so I think we're finding fermentation being a great sort of ingredient for more plant-forward, plant-based, plant-centric ways of eating.
That's a great way to end that part of the discussion. I have just one more library question, but it looks as if I have a couple of questions in the chat that I really want to get to, so I don't hog all your time. But I ask every single person that I interview this question.
Mm-hmm.
What are you reading?
Oh, so many books right now.
I believe that.
Yeah, so many books, but there's a, does it have to be children's books? I am reading a couple children's books, and actually I have slight dyslexia, so I listen to my books. So I'm just looking at my audio book list, but I just finished and love What a Mushroom Lives For. It's an ethnography, so food ethnographer, cultural anthropology. It's an ethnography about mushrooms, and it's the second book in a trilogy of ethnographies. And the very first one was called Mushrooms at the End of the World. Uh, uh, like life and hope, something like life and hope and capitalist ruins. I forgot the subtitle. And this I have been waiting and waiting for, and it just got released. So I love this book. And then a children's book that I just finished that I really loved is and I listened to my children's books, The Last Mapmaker. Love that book. Yeah, so those are the two books that I just finished.
It's fantastic. Thank you for that. So I have a couple of questions here, June, from the audience, and I think these are great questions. The first one is, someone would like to know, what do you do to become a food ethnographer? I knew people were going to want to be you. And what steps would you recommend they follow?
Yeah, so I went to school and studied anthropology, cultural anthropology, and then applied it to food. So I wrote a thesis on food and fantasy in South Korea during globalization. And so I actually looked at food through the lens of globalization, but also through the lens of like these sort of big aspirations that Korea was going through right after the IMF. And so you could take a few cultural anthropology classes and then, you know, start learning theories and ethnography practices of ethnography, which a lot of people think ethnography is interviewing, but ethnography is much more about deep listening. So listening to what people say and what they don't say, and, you know, starting to put the pieces all together into larger cultural drivers of practice and change. You can read a lot of ethnographies. There's a lot of ethnographies available, like the two that I mentioned about mushrooms would be a good start. You could, I mean, kids can be an ethnographers in their own lives. You could ask questions. You could ask your parents and your grandparents about their food traditions. I started to have regular Zoom meetings with my mom. And rather than just sort of chatting about this or that or listening to her talk about her life, I told her, Mom, I'm gonna interview you like an ethnographer. And so I started asking her these questions about, the food she loved growing up and what they meant. And she started sharing a lot of stories, which solved some personal questions for me. But she shared a story about kimchi, that she hated the time when kimjang in Korean is the time where they make lots of kimchi, like kimchi for the whole extended family together to last the whole season. And she said, my brothers were never asked to make it, but me and my sister were asked to make it. And it was always during finals. And so, like, it made me so angry that, I should be studying, but I was asked to make kimchi and, it was so unfair. And so I started learning a lot of stories by just asking my parents what they like, what they ate, what foods they learned to make, what was their first food that they remembered growing up. So very simple questions like that.
And so if we do have any kids on the call, I mean, I think that's the best recommendation I've heard so far. Just ask your parents questions, ask other people questions, and get started that way. I knew this question was going to come, June, so I have to ask it. And you did allude to it a little earlier, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to bring you back. But do you have any plans to develop a line of books, films, or other resources for the adult audience? But I will say children's books can also be for adults. So I'll qualify the question by saying you can still read our books if you're an adult.
That's what I think. And actually to like simplify and refine and get the essence of a very complex person into 26 pages of a picture book is really hard. I write for people of all ages. So for me, I think everyone can read Sandor Katz and learn a lot. Actually, when I write children's books, and I do want to write a series of eating books, I'm actually writing for the parents or the educators or the caretakers who are reading it to their kids. So I think about both the reader and the listeners, in mind. So actually, it's sort of I have these ideas. So if food is the first lesson that we must teach our kids and invest in it, take it back from the food industry. I'm working out some books that might support both the caretakers, parents, as well as the kids.
That's beautiful. This is the first lesson. I have one more question here for you, and I think this is so funny, from one of our audience members, and it says, speaking of kimchi, how long does it last? I made some last year, about a year ago, and they want to know how long kimchi lasts.
Well, kimchi lasts as long as it tastes good to you. And so, frankly, you make the kimchi, leave it out. I'm sure this person allowed it to ferment, bubble, and you keep tasting it until it tastes good. And usually it runs out if you make a small batch. But right when it tastes good, you put it in the refrigerator. And refrigeration just slows the fermentation process. So you can keep it for a really long time. I have some kimchi from last year that I made in the summer. Literally a hot mess kimchi, a water kimchi that I made in the summer, and I still have it. Yeah. And with some super sour old kimchi, that's really super sour. And I've seen people just, if there's like some mold growing on top, you just like lift it out, and you can even wash the kimchi if you want. But the best thing to make with old super sour kimchi is kimchi fried rice. So you take it out, chop it up, stir fry it in some good fat, and then add some rice, stir fry it, and add an egg, and it is the best.
Listen to that. So whoever asked that question, you just got a recipe for free. June Jolie, you have been an absolute pleasure to interview. Thank you so much for joining us for this program. I want to be sure to be respectful of your time, especially given the fact that you're on the East Coast. I don't see any other questions here. Let me just do a really quick check. It looks like we have them all. We appreciate you being a part of this program, a part of our Heart and Hand program. Again, to the audience, this is our effort to really address diversity, equity, and inclusion through literacy, through conversation, and through discourse. She has been so wonderful and so patient working through the technology. If anyone listening has a suggestion of someone that they'd like us to interview, please send it to us, and we'll make sure that you get a form at the end of this program. If there's someone else you'd like to see, let us know, and we'll see if they would be as kind as June Jolie to come and speak to us. Thank you so much. You have a great evening.
Oh, it was so fun. Thank you.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.